If it was up to the Haredim, they wouldn't need to be in conversation with anything going on the outside. When the Brisker Rav was asked, should we be teaching Machshevet Israel in our schools? His answer was, what is Machshevet Israel? And when he was answered, well, Machshevet Israel is understanding different systems, different ways of thought, Rav Hirsch on the one hand, and Rambam, and so on. He said, no, we should just be teaching what's right. And really, if it was up to the Haredim, there wouldn't be a need for this articulation because it's a closed system. The trouble is nowadays, of course, when you're so big, when you have internet, when you're exposed, then you need to be telling yourself some ideological story. And then, of course, it gets complicated because the ideology is never going to really match exactly what you're doing, which is based on intuition and instinct and so on.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Dayan Yehoshua Pfeffer wrote the following lines last year. Is isolationism a viable philosophy for religious life? The answer depends on how one views the world. If earthly reality is replete with value and meaning, goodness and godliness, then the very concept of a segregated Charedi space becomes religiously and morally untenable. There can be no withdrawal from the world, modern or otherwise, if the earthly reality in all its richness is where God's commandments are meant to be practiced. If the tree of life is implanted within the garden of Derech Eretz, the way of the earth, then the only way to eat its fruit is to live within the spheres of the earthly. But if this is not the case, if the tree of life grows outside of the world, leaving the secular space devoid of meaning and bereft of significance, then isolationism becomes a valid and realistic option. This philosophy of isolationism, along with a strong emphasis on the miraculous and direct divine involvement in our lives, such that the normal rules of cause and effect are irrelevant, have been the backbone of Haredi society for years. This has led to a Haredi de-emphasis on working for a living, serving in the army, and more. Perhaps such ideas could have acted as the basis of a society, or at least could have avoided impacting the country at large when the Haredi population was quite small. That's no longer the case, and isolationism and reliance on miracles has become a serious issue that affects Jews everywhere. At this point in Israel's history, it's becoming increasingly difficult to see that philosophy as a valid way of running a growing society of Haredi Jews. It's easy to forget that until 21 months ago, many Israelis outside of the Haredi world cared more about the ultra-Orthodox joining the workforce than about their participating in military service. Back then, many of us assumed that the IDF had no need for additional soldiers. And while it bothered us that an entire sector of the population was essentially exempt from serving in the IDF, we didn't think that that was as much of an existential threat to the state of Israel as the need to assimilate them into the Israeli economy. Today, both aspects are seen as not only wrong, but also treacherous to the future of Israel. Dayan Pfeffer has been at the forefront of working within the Haredi world, a community with which he personally identifies and in which he lives, in order to help move it into a healthier relationship with modernity. As he explains, it's easy to argue that the Haredi position was necessary and vital to the growth of Torah Judaism after the Shoah and in the early decades of Israel's existence. But while that may have been true then, it's no longer the case. Today, ultra-Orthodox Jews need to find ways to engage with modernity by working, serving in the IDF, and more, without losing their distinctive Haredi identity. Together, we discussed examples of how miraculous thinking has impacted Haredi life, whether the Haredi philosophy is primarily a result of theology or of sociology, to what degree members of the Haredi world believe that which they profess regarding God's direct and obvious involvement in everyday life, what it means to be Haredi, and how that identity can be reconciled with increased involvement in secular society, changing Haredi attitudes towards the state of Israel, and much more. This is a challenging, respectful, and essential conversation for anyone concerned about the future of Torah Judaism in Israel and throughout the world. We'll get to our conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Dayan Yehoshua Pfeffer is rabbi of Or Harash in Ramot, Yerushalayim. A close disciple of Rav Asher Weiss, he is founder and head of the Iyun Institute for Charedi Responsibility, chair of the Netzach Yehuda Nachal Charedi organization, which has supported Charedi soldiers in the IDF for 25 years, and teaches at Hebrew University's law school. He lives in Ramot with his wife and 6 of their 8 children. Dayan Yehoshua Pfeffer, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Pleasure, Scott. Nice to be with you.
Today we're going to be speaking about issues in the Charedi world, which you have discussed extensively. A lot of what we're going to talk about appears in an article you wrote in the Sapir journal last August. I'm going to quote something you said there. You wrote that, "I will argue that when it comes to matters of civic life, central elements within Israeli Charedi society, the society in which I live and where I proudly raise my children, have defined a faithful life on God's earth in a radical and somewhat anomalous way that shifts the balance between the natural and the miraculous in strong favor of the latter. Given current challenges concerning Haredi participation in Israel, this definition requires urgent adjustment." That is a nice topic sentence for a conversation. And I'd like to ask you for some examples of what you mean by the Haredi tendency of shifting the balance in favor of the miraculous. Where is that manifest, for example?
Well, the most obvious place where that's manifest is in the area of going to work, meaning the fact that in Israeli Haredi society, there is a strong tendency, and we can talk about numbers if you want, but whichever percentages we're going to give it, the tendency is exceedingly clear of not participating in gainful employment, not participating in the workforce is certainly very anomalous. And a lot of the rhetoric behind that, I won't say that this is necessarily a mindset that is present in your kind of everyday thinking, in your everyday kind of people go about their business and they're thinking in this mindset. But the rhetoric which is behind that is that, listen, whether you work more or less is not going to make a difference. Everything is min hashamayim. And, Parnasa is from year to year, it's Katzah from Rosh Hashanah and so on. And therefore, this whole space of the workforce is not a space where we want to invest our energies. And that filters through to many other areas too. But the workforce is one good illustration of how this makes a difference, of how this is the way people live. Now, we could definitely discuss which came first. Did the theology precede the kind of sociology, or are there other reasons why this developed? And then the theology is kind of backs that up. But the answer is that's a nuanced question. And the truth is that they go together. And the theology, if you want, which I discussed in this particular article, is a part of that story. And it applies to many other areas that make a difference. Again, you could always ask, to what degree is a theology the central piece in this broader picture? But for example, army service. So certainly it's relevant there too. You'll have a lot that will say either the more, if you want, common claim, which is that the fact that we are studying Torah is no less significant for the defense of the Jewish people than actually serving in the IDF. That itself is a radical statement, and that is a very common statement that you'll hear in the Haredi streets. And the more extreme statement is that, if everybody would be just learning Torah, then we wouldn't need an army at all. Again, to what degree is that a commonly held belief, or to what degree is it just what the the news outlets like to quote as the kind of more extreme positions. Either way, we could get into that. But again, it's just an illustration of how this kind of thinking is present or underlies a lot of the kind of sociology and the way in which Haredi society operates.
Well, I'd like to ask a little bit more about the degree to which they actually believe it, which you said is an interesting question which came first, the sociology or the theology, but to the degree that it is presented as a theology. And in your article, you give numerous sources. You mentioned the Chavetz Chaim, the Bechlev Me'Eliyahu, important recent sources over the past 100, 150 years, who say that essentially hishtadlut, which means working for a living and being active and that affecting results rather than it merely being a mask because we have to pretend it affects anything, but it doesn't really affect anything. They say that the hishtadlut is really just a way of making it look like you have some say in what happens to you, but in reality, you actually don't. My question is this. Anyone, I think, who looks around will see, and you may have given this example specifically, it is more likely that somebody who invests in real estate, he might lose his money, but he also might make millions of dollars. A school teacher, in all likelihood, will not. And if what they believe is really what they believe, how do they reconcile actual experience with what they are saying is actually the way it works?
Yeah, so that's certainly a part of the Sapir article where I do mention that a significant flaw in this type of thinking is that people do not live this way. In real life experience, whether you're Charedi or otherwise, the vast majority of people will live a worldly life that takes strong account of consequences, of outcomes that follow from our worldly behavior. And they won't say, well, since everything is up to Kodesh Baruch Hu, I'm not going to put in those extra hours. I'm not going to get a degree. I'm not going to cut my spending. That's how people live. And this is I would say that the kind of theology that I mentioned from these sources is a very yeshiva-oriented theology. Why do I say yeshiva-oriented? Because it can work well in a yeshiva environment, which is where the kind of figures who strongly support this theology actually operated in a yeshiva space. When you're in a yeshiva space, then it's much easier to be able to work with this kind of ideology and theology. And the truth is that a lot of the kind of Haredi thinking, again, in the official rhetoric and in much of the kind of rabbinic proclamations, it's definitely strongly related to the yeshiva experience. When you're in a yeshiva or a kollel experience, then you can really buy in to this kind of thinking. And among other ideas, for example, the idea that you look for chumros, you look for strictures and stringencies in a halachic sense, that works well in a yeshiva environment where your interaction with the world is limited. It's not the same as when you're in the business world. It's not the same when you're in this kind of, secular space, not secular in the sense of anti-religious, just regular, the worldly space. And then going with these chumras will be much more of an impediment, will be much more, will have much more ramifications on your life. And I think that it's possible to a degree that this is not just a practical issue, right? Are you in yeshiva and therefore you don't have and so on? But it could be also that if you'll speak to the rabbis who will tell you about this kind of mindset or model, theological model, they'll say, well, you know what? Yeah, it needs a certain level. Meaning if you'll speak to, the Michtav Meliyahu kind of mindset, then he even writes this. He says, this whole idea that I'm speaking about of relying on this hashgacha, that things do make a difference, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, well, it's not for everyone. It's only for these kind of special type of like B'nai Torah, people who are deeply engaged and engrossed in their spiritual growth, in their Torah study. Meaning, I'm highlighting, if you want, the more practical or pragmatic considerations that this only works in the yeshiva space, but even kind of latent intrinsic to this kind of theology is that really it's only for those kind of guys anyway.
Meaning, if you are a regular frum Jew who is not a full-time resident of a yeshiva, for example, then it's not only that you shouldn't live your life like this, but that your hashgacha is a little bit less and your hishtadlus needs to be more. Is that what he's saying?
Kind of. He's saying that you can aspire to this, but that aspiration, he said, listen, you have to go through the Michtav Eliyahu. It's really it's a whole system, and it's a complex system. And I have to, be honest and say I don't really buy into the system that he speaks about. I don't identify with it, but he's very, very anxious about striking the balance because he knows that somebody could espouse this, somebody could buy into a system, and he could lose big time. And he says you have to, what happens if you end up losing out? What happens if you become poor? Well, you need to be on a level where, having gone through that and actually losing out and being disappointed, you won't feel any disappointment because it's all from Kodesh Baruch Hu. And most people, he says, are not on that level, and therefore, if you're not on that level, then you shouldn't be buying into the system at all because it's not going to work for you. And you have to find your precise balance because he says you mustn't be in a place where you'll end up being heretical. He even says this, you'll be a kofer. You'll end up being a heretic because you'll lose your income, and they'll say, well, clearly this doesn't work at all, and it's not min hashamayim, it just depends on what I do, and then you'll be a heretic. And then he says, well, but you don't want to be heretical on the other side by not going with what I'm saying, lechatchila, mean, from a priori, and then you'll also be a heretic. So you have to find your balance. So Michtav Eliyahu himself is very nuanced in this. He realizes that this is not plain sailing, while some of the other sources just put it out there and say, yeah, this is how it works, and that's it.
That's very interesting. Thank you. And I realize it's a lot to ask for an entire theology in a couple of minutes on a podcast. So I realize that people should read the Michtav Eliyahu inside to get the full understanding of what this is all about.
Right. While again, like I said before, I have difficulty with the whole way in which he presents the system.
Part of the problem, I think, a lot of people in the non-Charedi sectors, but still religious sectors of Israeli society have, especially now after October 7th with the army, is what sometimes seems to be a type of hypocrisy. And I'll give an example of what I mean by that. At least according to my reading of the sources, even if, and I don't think this is very obvious, but even if one were to argue that, for example, Torah learning protects, in an active causative way that can be traced, so to speak, that seems to be, if anything, in the area where those people are learning, meaning it's almost like concentric circles. The closer you are to the learning, the more likely you are to be protected, such as the Rishalmi that talks about the Neturei Karta. The people who are defending the city are the people learning, or more accurately, teaching in that city. And at the same time, we see that yeshivot don't go to the front lines. If anything, if they're near the front lines, they often withdraw and go to Yerushalayim or Beit Shemesh or Bnei Brak to a place that's safer instead of learning near where the fighting is taking place. So it's sometimes hard to take seriously the claim that, well, we protect as much or more, or if there were only yeshiva learners, we wouldn't need the army, when even if one were to accept the sources that say that yeshiva learning, or Torah learning, I should say, or maybe even Torah teaching is that which protects, at least to a certain degree, you'd say, then why are you leaving the area where it protects and saving yourself as opposed to being near the soldiers who could use your help?
Yeah, so on that particular issue, there was actually a lot of discussion within the Charedi space and among Rabbanim of, for example, when there's a campaign or a war or danger in a certain location, is it appropriate that yeshivas should relocate in other locations or not? And there were some yeshivas that did, some that didn't. That itself was a question that really came up within the kind of rabbinic discourse in the Charedi space. But what you're bringing up, though, is a broader issue. It's not just about that particular question. It's a broader issue, and that is: do we really believe this rhetoric? Do we really espouse it? Do we really live by this rhetoric? And part of the problem is that in the Charedi space, it hasn't become about Torah study per se. It's become more about the kind of Charedi identity, if you want, which is related on the one hand to Torah study, but not exclusively related to Torah study. It's about how do you mold the typecast that the Charedi world wants to promote or wants to cultivate in those formative years, which are also the years where people go to the army. It's about a sense of belonging and identity. Do you want a local Haredi identity, or do you want to be an identity that's broader, that's part of the general Jewish people, part of the state of Israel? It's about a sense of responsibility. Do we have responsibility for the army in the sense of actually doing the fighting, or is our responsibility limited to those areas that conventionally or traditionally Haredi society has been most engaged in? And the Haredi model developed when Haredi society was small and when this kind of very localized sense of responsibility and, if you want, this total investment of resources, whether manpower or other resources internally in the world of religious devotion, in a world of Torah study, just made a lot of sense. To the degree that Israel, broadly speaking, didn't have any problem with it in the late 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s. It didn't come up. And there was an understanding of, you know what, this makes sense. We want to rehabilitate the Torah world. We want to allow for Haredi society to funnel all of its energies into this space. And as time, and by the way, in those years, it was also obvious, it was taken for granted that someone who's not a part of this project, somebody who isn't investing his nights and days in Torah studies in the full sense of the word, should be serving in the IDF. And basically, all Rabbanim of these years, including Rav Shach, who's on the record on this many times, he said, yeah, of course, anyone who's not in Torah study needs to be in the army, because if he's not, then he's considered a roidef of the Torah world. He's threatening the Torah world because he undermines the legitimacy of that exemption for those who are really dedicated to Torah study. So that was how it was. And part of the problem is that, you're paying the price for your success, quote unquote. Haredi society has grown so much, has really, proliferated, flourished in many senses. But that undermines the legitimacy of all these, boys not being in the army, not being, and you this is really a time, I think today is a time of at the very least, that obligates us, that renders us duty bound to do this rethinking of where are we. And that's not easy. It's not easy for a society that hasn't been challenged in the past, at least not externally. I think you have internal challenges that really require us to do this, but also externally hasn't had this challenge. And today that's really where we are. That's where you have all this resentment and anger and frustration that you're mentioning politely, of course, but you're mentioning, and the rhetoric which you're mentioning, you can call it hypocrisy. I don't think it's a blatant hypocrisy. It's just the difficulty of recalibrating, of rethinking, where you go. And this has been pointed out by others. One of the places is the famous article about rupture and reconstruction, which I'm sure you're familiar with. That, what happens in the Haredi space is not like a well articulated ideology. It doesn't work in, this is our philosophy, now we're going to implement it and realize it. It's a kind of, way of life which is understood, goes from generation to generation. This is what we do. And all of a sudden, 1 second, this is what we do? Or maybe we should be doing something else now. Maybe it's time. And the Rabbanim, the rabbinic leaders of the Haredi space, they, in their thinking, these kind of changes should not be happening from top down, because that could undermine the foundations. It could lead to a kind of wholesale, I don't want to use too strong a word, but a wholesale collapse of what things look like. And therefore, let's see how this can develop from bottom up. But bottom up, there's problems in this developing because you're paying a huge social price, and who's going to be doing this? And therefore, this is why we're at this juncture today where things really have to change significantly. But the question is, how exactly will that take place is really, where we are now.
That's a really good point, and I'm going to get back to that soon. I'd like to dig down a little more, though, in terms of what you just said, the mimetic tradition, to cite Rabbi Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik in Rupture and Reconstruction, this idea that it's just the way things are and people understand it implicitly. And on some level, that's an interesting way. I never put that together, that particular thinking with the Charedi world, because I'm confused in looking at this sort of confluence and this confusion, perhaps, of theology and ideology along with sociology. When you say, well, your theology seems to be, it might not work with the Gemara. You talk about that too, how some of these ideas of Rav Dessler's and the Chavetz Chaim's, for example, are relatively new and don't really line up with the weight of tradition. It's not a complete innovation, but the idea that everything is Min HaShamayim and our Hishtadlut has very little to do with anything, certainly not the dominant position until close to modernity. At least it seems that way to me. But apart from the problem of where exactly in our tradition does this come from, there's also the issue that I mentioned before of it negating experience. Experience doesn't seem to work with this theology. And then finally, really, there's this confusion of what's driving what. Is sociology driving the theology, or is theology driving the sociology? Such that when I have said that I don't think that the theology works even in the sources about, for example, Haredim learning instead of going to the army, I've been told, and I think it's accurate, well, that's not really what it's about. It's really about the sociology. It's really about, we just don't want them to go to the army because it's dangerous for them. It will undermine the society. So the theology is almost a veneer, a covering for something that's more sociological in nature. And of course, that's also true when experience shows that it doesn't really work. Let me give what might be a silly example. The Chazon Ish is reported to have said, there will never be a missile or a rocket hitting Bnei Brak, at least that's what they say he said, because there's so much Torah learning here. Until a few weeks ago, a missile hit there, in which case it was said, don't rely on that, that's misreported, or something like that. That's not what he said. Well, for 60 years, that was what he said. Now, suddenly, it's not true anymore, so it's not what he said. So it's hard to know what's driving what at times, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
That's a tradition from the Chazon Ish, and then later on it was reinforced by Reb Chaim Kanievsky. There's even written material on this tradition, but I don't want to get into that because it's just a small detail. I'll tell you, Haredi society has or operates based on instinct more than anything else, and there's a certain, I would call it, traditional instinct or traditional senses that a lot of the decisions made within Haredi society, I think, are based on. You call it instinct, you call it intuition, maybe, is even, a kind of deeper sense. When the state was established, that intuition of the, Haredi leadership, the rabbinic leadership, that intuition told the leadership and the Haredi space that, you know what, right now we need to be investing all we've got in ensuring the continuity, the perpetuation of the Torah world. The Torah world was in shambles after the Shoah, and it required a tremendous pioneering spirit, just like Zionism, by the way. It required a kind of pioneering spirit to ensure the rehabilitation of that Torah space. At the same time, there was, of course, a deep suspicion concerning Israel, concerning Zionism, concerning, the Zionist spirit was a new spirit. It was a spirit that said that our national mission is a mission that needs at least as much, and in many cases, far more, energy and investment than our spiritual and religious mission. And it just recast the entire framing, the entire typecast of what a Jew looks like. And from the traditional perspective, this was a threat. This was something that was looked upon as being something deeply dangerous to the future of the Jewish people. And therefore, those instincts, those rabbinic instincts, those traditional instincts, those senses, that intuition, whatever you want to call it, that was what drove this Haredi spirit, this Haredi revival of the tradition, preservation of the tradition, whatever you want to call it. And I think that at the end of the day, one should recognize that spirit, intuition, whatever, was deeply important in preserving a lot of the deep kind of devotion, a lot of the deep, and even within Israel, I think that the Haredim need some credit. even a lot of credit for ensuring a lot of the continued kind of devotion, dedication, fidelity to the tradition in many ways. Of course, this can be argued because what ifs are always arguable. What if there was no Charedi space and everybody would have bought into the kind of more, let's call it Mizrahi at the time, the Rav Reines kind of model. We're a part of Israel. We're buying into the model. I'm saying post 67, you have the Rav Kook model, which is a different model, and then later on you have the more Chardal model. These things develop over time, but the Chardal model, which is the kind of very strong religious Zionist model, don't forget that it's predicated to a large degree on what the Haredim were able to preserve. And that was more instinctive and based on intuition than anything else. Now, of course, once you have that model there, then it needs its theological underpinnings. It needs somebody to speak out the ideology of it. But generally speaking, whoever it was that did that was not somebody that grew up in the Haredi space. In the 60s, there was somebody called Uriel Zimmer. Uriel Zimmer was this German Baal Tshuva. He grew up in Germany, was not a religious Jew. He became a Baal Tshuva and became this kind of Litvish model that he espoused. And then afterwards, he moved on. He became a Chabadnik. He joined Chabad. I saw a 2022 republishing of the contrast that he wrote in 1960 some, explaining what Haredi Judaism is all about. Meaning, like I said, it's not a well-articulated and well-defined ideology. The trouble is that ultimately, you're going to be again, if it was up to the Haredim, they wouldn't need to be in conversation with anything going on the outside. When the Brisker Rav was asked, should we be teaching Machshevet Yisrael in our schools? His answer was, what is Machshevet Yisrael? And when he was answered, well, Machshevet Yisrael is understanding different systems, different ways of thought, Rav Hirsch on the one hand, and Rambam, and so on. He said, no, we should just be teaching what's right. We need to teach the right way, and that's it. And really, if it was up to the Haredim, there wouldn't be a need for this articulation because it's a closed system. The trouble is nowadays, of course, when you're so big, when you have internet, when you're exposed, then you need to be telling yourself some ideological story. And then, of course, it gets complicated because the ideology is never going to really match exactly what you're doing, which is based on intuition and instinct and so on. And that's why it's really, when you're trying to thrash this out and good for you. And really, it's never going to mesh, it's never going to be an exact fit.
Then let me ask the impossible question, given what you just said, but I think it's important for some further questions I'd like to ask you. What does Haredi even mean now? What is the definition of a Haredi Jew? Given that you said it's really a way of life, but what differentiates that way of life from, say, other Orthodox Jews, either in Chutz La'aretz in its modern or centrist Orthodox variety, or in Israel in the Dati Lumi variety? Is it merely the isolationism, or is it something else also?
Well, first and foremost, it is an attitude towards modernity. There's really two ways to approach modernity. One way is to say we're modern and we'll be Orthodox together with our modernity. And that's the modern Orthodox approach. And that says that our strategy of dealing with the challenges of modernity is education. We'll educate our kids to take the good and to reject the bad. And that's the modern Orthodox system. In the Haredi space, there's a fear of going in that direction. And the approach, rather than an educational approach, is an isolationist approach. And that is a very deep distinction between the modern Orthodox world and between the Haredi world. Now, there's a lot that goes together with that. There's many, different facets and elements, and some of them, are more directly related to that isolationist instinct, and some of them are more, I would say, peripheral to it. But for example, Torah study. Well, Torah study as your flag, that's something which started a few hundred years ago. Let's say Rav Chaim Volozhin was the one to articulate it maybe, but it was there before. But of course, in the Charedi space, it receives a certain hue because it becomes Torah study to the exclusion of everything else. And that exclusion of everything else is related to that isolationist instinct. But did it begin with that isolationism? No, it was there before, but it received a certain, direction. It took a certain twist. The idea of halacha l'chumra in everything. Was that there before? Yeah, it was there on some level. But of course, the isolationism, it reinforces it because it means that our version of halacha is a special one and it's different from everybody else's version of halacha because we're looking for that l'chumra, which is very unusual. It's not really very traditional, but you could say it was there among the elites, and then it became popularized, which creates tension once you become so big and so on. Just like the Torah study model creates tensions once you're so big because it's difficult to realize it on such a scale. The idea of das Torah, of following your rabbis, in every sense and not just in a halachic sense and so on. Was it there before? Benny Brown has an article about this. I don't know if it's rendered into English, but he has an article on this and he says, well, you can't say it's all new because there was such a model there in the past, but you also can't say that it's an old and hallowed tradition. Of course, it took a twist, and that twist is also related to the kind of isolationist instinct because the opposite of das Torah is what you would call common sense, right? It is common. And well, if it's common, then it's not isolationist, meaning all of these things are related to the isolationist instinct or intuition or strategy, you could call it, right? It's a strategy of dealing with the more caustic and dangerous and harmful elements of modernity. But on the other hand, it creates a system which you can't say, well, it's just isolationism. There are many different elements that go into this model of being Charedi, and indeed they are being challenged today in a world or in an era where that isolationism can't really work the way it worked before. The walls of Haredi society today are deeply porous. They deeply absorb. The fight against television was an easier win or an easy win relative to the fight against internet, and the very need, and I think it's a religious need, to take responsibility for Israel in a deep sense also doesn't allow the same level of isolationism. And therefore you have to rethink, or you have to reimagine a Haredi society and define, okay, so what is it that we really need to preserve of this model? And this is not easy. By the way, this is a lot of my, a lot of my work and a lot of my writing and a lot of my kind of educational challenge. And we have many groups of Haredim that go through the Iyun Institute and our, kind of educational programs. And this is what we think about.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask about, because if this isolationist tendency is essential rather than peripheral to the Haredi mindset and the Haredi self-identity, then I'm sure you have an answer to this, but in looking from the outside, in saying, well, we want you to be Haredi, but at the same time, we want you to, for example, join the army and join the workforce and have more interaction, undermine that isolationism. It reminds me a little bit of Rabbi Nachman's turkey prince. It's the famous metaphor of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov about a prince who believes he's a turkey. He takes off all his clothes and starts eating scraps under the table, and no one can cure him until one wise man, who represents the tzaddik, comes and says, I got the idea. I know how to do it. He goes under the table, naked also, and tells the turkey prince, I'm also a turkey. At his signal, someone throws the wise man a shirt. The wise man puts it on, and the turkey prince says to the wise man, why are you wearing a shirt? You're a turkey. And the wise man says, hey, you can still be a turkey if you're wearing a shirt. And the prince hears the logic of that, and he puts on a shirt too. A couple days later, the wise man signals, and they throw him a pair of pants. So the turkey prince says, how can a turkey wear a pair of pants? And the wise man says, you can still be a turkey and wear a pair of pants. So the prince, who thinks he's a turkey, hears the logic of that and puts on his pants until eventually he's cured. I wonder if that's really what's happening over here. We're saying, hey, you can still be Haredi even if you join the workforce. Hey, you can still be Haredi even if you join the army. At a certain point, why is this not just saying I'm Haredi, but it actually is completely undermining what it means to be Haredi?
Well, that's an interesting way of phrasing the question. Obviously, it's the question is the big question of the future of Israel. Certainly, the future of Haredi interaction with Israel, which is, I think, on many levels, the future of Israel. Haredi society is big and still growing fast, and what Haredi society does in this sense is deeply, profoundly, and perhaps existentially impactful on the future of Israel. But the way you phrase the question reminds me of a small anecdote that I'll tell you. I was I was at a gas station, and as I exited the gas station, somebody hitches a ride with me. So I invite him into my car, and he's going to Ramat. I live in Ramat. I brought him with me to Ramat, and on the way, he starts asking me all these questions about my car. He says, like, how old is it? How much did you pay for it? What's the condition? I asked him after a certain time, like, what's the deal? Like, why are you basically asking questions about cars? Like, what is this? So he says, well, I deal in cars. So I says, one second, when you got into my car, you said you're an avreich. I asked you, like, what do you do? You said, I'm a avreich. So are you an avreich or are you a car dealer? Like, what do you do? He says, well, I'm an avreich that also deals in cars. And in the beginning, when I heard this, I said, well, that's not very good. Meaning, being an avreich means the guy is like full-time to study, like fully engrossed in learning. What's the deal over here? An avreich who's also a car dealer. What is that? But later on, I thought, you know what? There's something nice about that. An avreich doesn't mean necessarily somebody, or it no longer means somebody who is all out Torah study. That's all I do. An avreich is a certain type. It's a ben Torah. It's a guy that, if I would have more spare time, I would be spending that time on Torah study. It's a typecast. It's a certain, type of individual. And yeah, but you could be an avreich that sells cars, provided that you maintain and the same thing for your Haredi in the state of Israel. Yeah, we need Haredim in the workforce, we need Haredim in the army. However, you can do that. It just depends on how you define what it means to be a Haredi. Insofar as Haredi meant to the exclusion of being in the army, then yeah, what are you going to do? But you know what? We have precedents. It used to be that you can't be a Haredi and be at Hebrew University. Because that's like a total contradiction. How can you be a Haredi guy that your mindset and your raison d'etre is this isolationist attitude towards, and yet be at Hebrew U, the spearhead of Israeli academia? How does that go together? Well, you know what? When I started at Hebrew U at 2008, 2009, there were no other people there with hats and jackets there, okay? That much I can guarantee you. I was really the only guy, at least on the Harat Sofim campus. But over time, in my third year at Hebrew U, there was an organized group of Haredim that received special stipends and so on and so on. And they came and studied at Hebrew U. And slowly but surely it developed. And then Haredi academia developed on many different levels. And of course, it came out of a need. There was a need for people to earn incomes, mainly for Haredi women, who were the sole breadwinners, and they had to make a decent income. And therefore, there was a need for academia. And slowly but surely, this developed into a place where, yeah, you know what? You can be Haredi and be in academia. It's not a contradiction in terms. And actually, those Haredim in academia now are getting the better shidduchim because those are the ones in greater demand. The market forces. There's one market in the Haredi space which is a wonderful free market, and that's the shidduchim market. And it works well, and it gives you a good indication why our market's so good, because they tell you what's going on in society. And so you see that being a Haredi in academia, that was okay, because we were able to make it work. And yeah, there were growing pains. In the beginning, there were these demonstrations against academia, which also related to market forces. Who is organizing these demonstrations against academia? Fine. And okay, that's how a society, functions, and that's okay. But over time, it became legitimate. And yeah, we know how to make it work. And I think it's the same thing with the army. We're learning how to make it work. Don't forget the whole pressure, at least the intense pressure of army service for Haredim is kind of since October 7th. Before then, I'm not saying there wasn't pressure. There was the law and this and that. But the general consensus on the Israeli street was, let's get them into the workforce. The army issue, the Agaf Taktivim of the finance ministry, meaning let's call it the finance ministry, strongly supported a proposal to just exempt Haredim from army service altogether. Why? Let's get them to work and then their kids will go to the army. Meaning let's just get Haredim at work. That's more urgent. The army, we'll live with it. That shifted dramatically after.
It was also based on an assumption that we needed a smaller army, not a bigger army that was blown up on October 7th.
Right. That's why that shifted dramatically on October 7th, as well as the pressures of war, and it's all legitimate. That shifted dramatically. And that's why the army established Hashmonaim, this new brigade. I'm here, Motzei Shabbos. I spent a Shabbos. This Shabbos, where was I? I was at a hotel in an event organized for the Hashmonaim brigade. It was organized by the Shomer Yisrael, formerly the Netzach Yehuda organization, and it was for the soldiers. It was actually the Miluim units, but Miluim units, it's not a Miluim unit. It's a Shlav, it's quote unquote Shlav Bet unit, but this is combat. It's a combat unit. People who did 6 months Shlav Bet. This is not your 2-week Shlav Bet. These guys were fighting in Gaza now for a few weeks and just came out. And as part of their coming out, so we arranged this event for them. And this is all new. And the standards there are remarkable. And it's a brigade. It's not just a unit, not just a battalion. And all of this is part of this kind of trust building exercise, which is a necessary process. I wish that it could be expedited. I wish that it could be, faster. We don't have patience. Israel doesn't have patience. I appreciate that. But at the same time, this is how it's happening. And I think we're on the cusp of real breakthroughs there. The numbers are still not great, and I'm the first to concede that. But that's how it'll be. And yeah, like you said, there'll be Haredim, and you can be in the army, and you could still get a wonderful shidduch in the Haredi space. And we're on the cusp of that breakthrough, and it needs to happen. And then, of course, you have to think about, okay, what does it mean to be Haredi? Where is this going? And so on. Those are important questions, and they need a lot of figuring out and working out. But a lot of that figuring out will also be, like you said before, the mimetic idea of Chaim Soloveitchik. It'll be that. It'll figure itself out. Haredim will not be the same as your average religious Zionist community or Chardal. How will they be different? Okay, so I'll do the thinking of that and some articulation. I'll explain why it's not Rav Kook and it's not Rav Reines and it's something else. And Major Shem in a month's time, we'll be holding a kind of conference on this, yeah? But will it be because of that? Will that be the defining? No, it'll happen. It'll happen and we'll figure it out and we'll be able to write about it. The writing is very important because nowadays people are asking these questions. But we'll let's talk in a year's time.
I was wondering if the Haredi world is moving towards a sort of Rav Reines style, I'll call it Zionism, even though that might be the wrong term. Let me better explain what I mean. Once upon a time, the Haredi world was distinguished in its attitude towards Israel as either thinking of it as a negative, an impediment to Geula, or perhaps, in the words of the Brisker Rav, something that has no religious meaning, has no halachic anything. So therefore, it's sort of a neutral existence. And I think that has changed significantly. We see it both in attitudes at the bottom and at the top. To use an easy example, if we look at some of the Haredi political parties following the most recent war against Iran, Aryeh Deri, the head of Shas, talked about the incredible miracles that were involved. Or, for example, the head of Gimel, Yitzchak Goldknopf, has actively advocated for Jewish resettlement in Gaza, not for security reasons, just to save Jewish lives, but obviously he's talking on some level about populating the land of Israel in a religious sense. That sounds to me a little bit like perhaps not a Geula-oriented, a redemption-oriented Zionism, though not necessarily not that, but something like a Rav Reines attitude saying the state of Israel is a divine gift. It's reflective of divine providence. Whether or not it's part of the ultimate redemption is a different question, but the state of Israel has positive religious value. Whether or not it's actually articulated in those terms, which is why I'm not sure they would say it's Zionism, in a lot of ways, call it that or call it something else, it sounds to me a little bit Zionistic.
Well, there's no question at all that the attitude towards Israel has changed and more perhaps I would say more accurately, is changing dramatically. And I think the Rav Reines model is a kind of Haredi model. I don't think the Rav Reines model is a non-Haredi model, but I don't want to give your viewers too much credit on knowing the distinctions in the whole kind of Mizrahi process and development and so on. But to your point, the process that Haredi society has undergone and is undergoing is what I would call a process of naturalization. You're in the same country, you experience the same challenges, you speak the same language, you are engaged in the same issues. There's going to be a process there of naturalization. And I think that this is the best possible process that Haredi society could undergo. That there was a need. I actually really think, I deeply believe this, there was a need for that kind of remaining separate in those formative years. That there was a need for that isolationist impulse. You know what? Again, I'm saying that even though I'm aware that you could say what if and maybe things could have been differently. I don't know. It's difficult in hindsight to apply your theories. But I do see the advantage that was gleaned, that was gained by that motion. And that there's something of you could just call it, I don't want to make a reduction, but you could call it like a kind of healthy conservatism. Let's see. Let's wait and see. Now, Haredi society paid a deep price for that. And the deep price was this, again, to use a strong term, a kind of alienation almost from parts of Israel. But over time, I see that today there's a growing closeness, that there's a growing identification with Israel. It's true on a cultural level, the kind of music that the kids will bring home from their high schools, from their, so again, the kids don't have smartphones, but they'll have like MP3 players, the old style stuff. And what are they putting on there? So it'll be your Hanan Ben Ari, it'll be your Israeli music, not even from music. Hanan Ben Ari is still like from, but not even, and not just on a cultural level, but just on an identification level. You're fighting a war for 2 years. It's going to make an impact. It requires a tremendous level of ideological energy to stay kind of away from that identification. That's true for our friends on the left. I think that for them to, they need a lot of energy to kind of stay where they are. But it's true for Haredi society too. And there is a real motion. And I think that motion is a motion of Kedusha. I think that motion is a motion of appreciating that this story of the state of Israel is our story. And that's the deepest shift that is taking place and that needs to take place. And that, with modesty and so on, that I'm a part of trying to promote the appreciation that, we could stay separate for a few years and say, let's see how this works out. But having seen how this is working out, having seen that the wars that Israel is fighting are the wars of Kiddush Shem Shemaim, are the wars of good against evil, having seen that this is becoming recognized by the entire world, that the state of Israel is supporting the godly values that are in danger across the West, and we're the ones that are supporting that. You can't stay neutral on this, You're a part of this. It's our story. It's the state of Israel's story is us. And I think there's a growing internalization of that. Of course, it requires people to do the work, whether me on the ideas level, whether others on the school level and the high school level and the communities level and youth movements. And I don't know, there's many levels that need people to do the work of this. It's not coming. You were generous to the top down. It's not coming top down. It depends what you call the top. But the raison d'etre of the top is more the preservation. We have to make sure that it doesn't crumble. And I appreciate that. But the work that's happening from the field is the work of this is us. This is our story. This is our responsibility. We need to be there, and we need to be there while preserving what it means to be Haredi. And you're right, that needs a lot of unpacking. Absolutely. We should do a separate whole episode just on that.
Absolutely. Then let me ask again, just one more question on that top-down issue, because one of the things that I fear, and obviously people like you, Dayan Pfeffer, are doing amazing work in trying to help the Charedi community retain its identity while at the same time contributing to society in a positive way and to themselves, frankly. What I find so difficult is that, speaking again top-down, maybe not necessarily only politically, but even religiously, it's what you wrote in your article. It's not just that this is what we do because it's what we do. It's a theological and halachic necessity. To do otherwise is not just called incorrect, but often called apikorsis, kfira, heresy. So how can one overcome in a society which gives so much credence to the top rabbis, the top authorities, when those top authorities, despite what's happening on the ground, are going to say any change of that sort is actually a fundamental violation of what it means not just to be Haredi, but to be a Torah Jew at all?
Well, you gave the answer to that in one of your previous questions. You said, well, there was this there was this working assumption that Bnei Brak is immune to missile threats. There's this promise, the Chazon Ish, right? No missiles will land in Bnei Brak. Well, and then a missile landed in Bnei Brak. So you know what? Well, how did I see? There was a letter by some Rabbanim of Bnei Brak. They said, Ze lo meduyak v'day lamevin. It's not precise, and the Mevinim will understand why it's not precise. You have a way of figuring things out. Ze lo nora. Ideological shifts, they happen quietly without, you don't need a Martin Luther over here. We don't need, it's not going to work like that. And, in the past, wow, I remember, just not so long ago, it's like 15 years ago, when there was a program, this is Rav David Label, who's also one of the leading figures in this movement. And Rav David Label was organizing these kollels where you also study programming while at the same time doing a morning Seder, learning, kind of combining. And that was perceived as being like the greatest of threats, either black or white, but gray is the most threatening. And I remember these broadsides of how this is heresy, it's kilayim, it's forbidden, it's the worst. And you know what? Since then, that movement has grown a lot. Thousands of Charedi, men have gone down that path, and no one blinks an eyelid. And what about the broadsides from 15 years ago? Nobody remembers them. They're not interesting. Now that's what we do. It goes back a little bit to what we discussed before about it's what we do, and the ideology will figure it out. And I think the Charedi Rabbanim today, even they are not speaking in the same language as they spoke a few years ago. Rav Moshe Elel Hirsch was American, so he's a little bit different to some of the others. And he said recently, it wasn't widely circulated, but he said in the last 100 years, he said, which you can argue the facts, but the way he said it, he said for the last 100 years we've been just learning, no working. He said, you know what, I see now that it's changing. Just think about that formulation. He said, I see now that it's changing. But how did that happen? Well, all these naughty people, yeah, maybe there were some naughty people, and there were some people that needed it because of they got a special heter, but that special heter, the degree of extenuating circumstances to get that special heter decreases over time. And I see now that there's a critical mass of people who are working, and yet they're still Bnei Torah. They're still a part of us. They're not different in kind. Yeah, that's how it happened. It used to be forbidden for women to drive in the Haredi space. Was it a formal prohibition? I don't know, kind of. You have tshuvas here and there will say, well, it's not sneeristic. I don't know. And then what happened? You had a lot of Americans that came here and they drove because why not? That's what we do. And then you had people with extenuating circumstances, and then they drove too. And then the level of degree that you need to drive became less. And now women drive, it became the norm in some places. In the more Hasidic world, less, but it changed. What about the Issa? Yeah, used to be also for women to vote. That changed pretty quick. When the Charedim entered politics. So yeah, okay, it used to be also. Now it's mutter. We need to do it. So I'm saying, don't worry. These things have a way of sorting themselves out.
I'll mention a particular story. I'm not going to say the name of the gadol because I'm not 100% sure I'm getting every detail correct, but the story, as I believe it was related on this podcast, is that a particular American Charedi gadol hador told his students that it is forbidden for them to leave yeshiva and go to medical school. And somebody asked him privately, what happens if everybody listens to you? We'll have no frum doctors. And he goes, that's not going to be a problem. The people who don't listen to me, they'll be the doctors.
Right. So you're not supposed to say that, but yes.
Okay. Dayan Pfeffer, I have one final question for you, and it's about that distinction between the modern Orthodox being willing to take the good and reject the bad, push away that which is dangerous, versus the Charedi isolationism, which is we're not going to even deal with the problem because I'm not going to let either one enter my purview so that I don't have to deal with it. If the Charedi world is going to start joining the workforce, going to Hebrew U, for example, and doing things more in line with that modern Orthodox attitude, from a Charedi perspective, how are they protected? In other words, they rejected the idea that you can really make that distinguishing mark. I guess you can call it the Rabbi Meir idea, following after Elisha ben Abuya, saying, I take the good, I throw away the bad stuff. They say, we can't do that. So are they simply saying now we can do it, or do they have a different way of dealing with the dangers of modernity?
They're protected by starting 70 years later. Meaning they're protected by having this wealth of experience. Modern Orthodoxy, wherever it started, let's talk about Rav Soloveitchik, or we can talk about, other points of beginnings, religious Zionism, the Mizrahi. We could speak about the different gedolim of that movement, as we mentioned before. It was done a long time ago, and for the duration, Haredi society could sit and did sit in this more isolated position and watch and learn and be able to develop the kind of accumulated experience that I think will be of tremendous benefit to Haredi society today, in this time, in this age, when Haredi society is becoming a greater part of the general Israeli space. And it's a two-way motion. Look at what's going on in Yeshiva University. All of a sudden, you have all these black hats there. And there are many. The right wing, look at the Rosh Yeshiva there. Well, Charedi. It's not all, but, there's a large contingency. Again, depends how you define Charedi. But the right wing of Yeshiva University is black hatters. So where are they? Are they Charedi? Like, what are they? Yeah. They're a Haredi version of that modern Orthodoxy. Is it different to the modern Orthodoxy? Yeah, it's different. In which way? In the way that it's able to think through the issues that will be and that do challenge societies that are involved in modernity with that accumulated experience of all those years. And I think that, think about, I don't know, issues like Torah study for women, ordination of women, I don't know, like the whole women's issue. Haredi society, I do not think, even though it's going to be engaged with modernity, I don't think it's going to go down the same path as modern Orthodoxy or certain parts of modern Orthodoxy. Again, this is all broad strokes, and of course there's a lot of nuance in this. But I think that its protection will be in its experience. Its protection will be in its starting position, if you want. The starting position of Haredi society in its engagement with modernity is a very different starting position from that of 70, 80, 90, 100, whatever years ago. And that itself, I think, is going to be the kind of the critical consideration or factor in determining or in how this plays out. Of course, a lot of unpacking, of course, and thinking about the specific issues and how and why and what. But if you ask me on the podcast, like a 3-minute answer, that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you. I do recognize that a podcast is the antithesis of nuance. I appreciate the attempt.
It's been good, and it's. I think this is this is on the higher end of trying to, to tackle that.
I certainly hope so. Well, Dayan Yehoshua Pfeffer, it's been a pleasure to meet you and to talk with you and to hear your very nuanced and important ideas. And thank you for all you're doing to help the Charedi society remain true to itself while also addressing the real issues that are there. I appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate you broaching this issue. I think that those who care about the future of the Jewish people, and most specifically about Israel, want to be familiar, want to be acquainted, and in the most, nuanced way possible. So I really appreciate the invitation. God willing, looking forward to next time.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.